Well, it's 10:45. So welcome to the session on navigating the present and future landscapes, advances and challenges in land change modeling. I'd like to thank Burak for inviting me to co-coordinate this, even though Burak was doing most of the heavy lifting. Burak's a professor at Texas A&M University. And we have people coming in. You can sit up close. The closer you sit, the larger the presenter looks. We want that. So our first presenter is Brett Bryan from Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. Bryan.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks Burak and Gil. So I'll be presenting the land use trade-offs version 2, the next generation national scale land use model for Australia, and just acknowledge my co-authors. Jinju and Nick are in the audience, and a bunch of others there, and also ClimateWorks, who's a partner organisation. So what we all know, and very quickly, is land is a complex system, has many requirements and demands, and so we need complex models. We need land to provide ecosystem services and contributions to people, of course, food. We have cities encroaching and competing for land. We have human land use degrading land in all sorts of ways, and water. We have a demand now to store carbon in land systems to help meet our climate goals. And we also have new demands on land for producing renewable energy, it's solar and wind and so on. So it's a very complex system, and we need complex models to understand all these components and look at solutions for a sustainable land system into the future. So we developed a model called LUTO, the Land Use Trade-offs models, from about 2008 to 2015. But the world changed. It couldn't answer questions that we were being asked around, can we meet net zero goals? Can we meet future demand for agriculture and food production? Can we do this without exceeding our catchment-based water limits and other planetary boundaries or environmental limits? So we co-designed a new model, entirely new, no single line of code remains. We asked our stakeholders, more than 300 stakeholders from across the country. We ran workshops in every capital city. We co-designed this new model from scratch. The outcome was LUTO 2, so a new model, a second generation spatio-temporal model of land system sustainability for Australia. It identifies optimal land use and land management strategies for Australia, which simultaneously meet domestic and international demand for agricultural production, climate targets, biodiversity targets, and catchment-based water yields. They're the constraints on the model. And it considers multiple scenarios, multiple uncertainties across climate, price, productivity, policy, diets, and so on. Has a long time horizon, out to 2100 if you want it. It's an annual model, and the study area is what we call high resolution, which is 1 kilometre square grid cells over the nation, which amounts to about 4 million grid cells of land use that we analyse. It's a Python package, it's open source, and it's on GitHub, and you can download it right now if you want. We redid the entire data set. So data sets spanning economics, land management, land use, climate, carbon sequestration, how soils store carbon, how trees store carbon over time under climate change, water impacts, fire, biodiversity, the lot. The whole model database is entirely new. The model starts with land use in 2010, so everything except the dark grey areas, that's public and Indigenous land. We can't cope with that yet, that's for the future, but for now, it's everything but that area. It has 28 different types of agriculture, crops and livestock, includes detailed agricultural modelling, and then the model says, given this land use in 2010 and given these rules and needs and targets that we want to achieve, climate, water, etc., what solutions need to go where and when across the landscape in order to achieve this? And so we've got a number of different demand side solutions, so population, income, consumption, diet change, food loss and waste reduction, bringing in alternative proteins, trade and export solutions, and then supply. So these change the demand equation, so how much agricultural production does Australia need to produce, and the supply side solutions, these are what happens on pixels, what happens on land. So each pixel has a choice of being in standard agriculture or under a different type of land use, so environmental plantings for nature and carbon, riparian buffers, monocultures for timber and carbon, range of bioenergy, agroforestry, so belt plantings with livestock in between and so on. If it's pixels in agriculture, you can also do a range of agricultural management strategies. So, range of fertilizer, treatments, energy. You can reduce methane from livestock through dietary supplementation. You can do regenerative ag for soil carbon. You can do change the way burning occurs in our savannas, and biochar for soil carbon. So all these a series of different solutions to try and achieve all those different environmental targets simultaneously. There's a range of indicators by which we test the performance of the model. So land use area, economics around cost, revenue, agricultural production, of course, water, irrigation, water use, catchment-based water stress, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sequestrations, emissions. These are all broken down by gas, so methane, CO2, N2O, etc. And biodiversity. So there's a hugely rich database on biodiversity, which incorporates over 10,600 individual species of plants and animals just in this model. A complex slide of how the model works, but essentially we take land use. Here's our what happens at the pixel, so it can be in agriculture or ag management or do these non-ag land uses. Here's our targets and limits, so we've got to meet food demand, meet greenhouse gas, ensure catchments don't go into water stress, and meet our biodiversity targets. These will go into a linear program. It's an enormously complicated linear program to solve. That's a Gurobi model. And then we get land use and its impacts on the way out, and that's an annual model out to 2010. The first application of LUTO that we've done is to see whether we can simply achieve land's requirements and obligations under the Paris Agreement. So an ambitious climate and carbon sequestration goal there. So achieve 1.5 degrees at 67% probability. GBF target 2, which is the 30 by 30, 30% of degraded land addressed by 2030. But still, we want Australia to meet its agricultural demand, both for domestic production and exports. And we don't want to put our water catchments into stress, so we don't want them to use more than 80% of the historical water yields. This is modelling that comes from a model called AusTimes, an economy and energy model. And AusTimes says for Australia to achieve that Paris Agreement target, land needs to remove this amount of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So it's a fair task for land, a fair requirement. And we don't know whether those actual targets can be met simultaneously. We just did not know that. And this model can tell us whether or not it can meet that. This is the output of the model. So you can select different indicators, or you can select the maps and the year that you want to map. And this tells us what the solution is for that particular problem. So this is the 1.567 degrees, the GBF target 2, and meeting future business as usual demand for food, crops and livestock, and not putting our catchments into water stress. So you can see fair amount of land use change, agroforestry, environmental plantings, particularly in the south and east of the country. This is a graph of the land use change, so you can see this is all agriculture and unallocated land. This is land use change down here, so you can see the scale of the change required. This is the greenhouse gas emissions, so this meets the emissions requirement of land coming out of the AusTimes model. And we're starting to explore these results now, and the imposition of the biodiversity target actually has quite a strong response on what you would do where and when on land. So if you're looking at, you don't worry about biodiversity, you do kind of ag management strategies. If you are worried about biodiversity, then the green is environmental plantings. That becomes a much stronger land use option into the future. So considering what policy and what targets that are important as a society has a very sensitive and influential influence on land use into the future. So this is actually my family farm. This is my brother's tractor. This is minimum till to keep carbon in the soil and to prevent too much evapotranspiration. So Australia's land sector can meet these ambitious climate goals, the biodiversity target, future ag demand and exports without stressing water catchment. So we know it can be done. So that's a policy outcome right there, a policy insight. However, we need a lot of change, transformational change in both land use and management. It's going to be costly, it's not going to be cheap, it's not going to be easy. And there are social license issues as well. And incorporating biodiversity targets has a strong effect. Where to from here? We're speaking with and dealing with lots of government agencies on this, finance sector, ag agencies, environmental agencies and so on, state and federal. Ongoing development, we're putting new solutions, new indicators in, and you know, it's just the start of the applications of the model. Thanks very much.
Very good, thank you. Dr. Bryan, we have time for a question as the AV person brings up the next presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a fascinating approach. Could you please explain a bit how the allocation algorithm is working? Is it equal competition of land use or is it hierarchical? So like per time step?
Yeah, it's each time step is an individual solution. It's a linear program. Mm-hmm. Each cell has a number of different land use alternatives, 28 agriculture, a number of non-ag, and plus if it's agriculture it can be managed in different ways. And so it's a very complex decision problem that the model optimizes. You can either minimize cost or maximize profit, and those targets are set as constraints to the model if you are familiar with linear programming.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Brian. Our next presenter is Marco Ferro from University of Bonn in Germany. Welcome, Marco.
Points I'm showing here, and they are only like it's only a way to show them all in one plot, but you can already see from here that this is the impact on the output in degrees Celsius. So this is how a single observation is impacting the value of the land surface temperature in the prediction of using the machine learning. And yeah, you can already see from here that we have that low feature values, so low level of, for example, here number of patches are decreasing the temperature, and it's basically the same here. You can see here, and yeah, it's a way to explain basically how the prediction of a model were generated, and yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much, Marco. And our next presenter is actually the person who originated the idea for this session, my good colleague Burak from Texas A&M University.
Thank you, Gil. So my graduate student, Rakibul Hassan, was going to present this. However, he was unable to come to the conference, so I will give the talk on his behalf. The demographics is the most familiar aspect of urbanization. Most of us, maybe even all of us, may have seen a version of this graph. In short, by the middle of this century, we expect 2.1 billion more people in urban areas, which means that we expect to see 1 million more people in cities every 5 days over the next 25 years or so. 1 million more people every 5 days in cities. But demographics is only part of the story. Urbanization also leads to significant physical transformation across landscapes. This is Shanghai in late 1970s. This is Shanghai today. But it's not only the large cities. For example, Uzungöl, which used to be a small village in Turkey, where I originally come from. This photograph is from early 2000s. This is about 15 years later. So it's not, we don't see this significant impact of urbanization demographically, but also physically, not only in large cities, but in what we would regard as rural places as well. And all this change comes accompanied by a lot of infrastructure development. In fact, large-scale infrastructure development is an integral part of this urban transformation. Road infrastructure, among all the different kinds of infrastructure, is different in the sense that it is what we call this linear type of infrastructure, which is very effective in fragmenting landscapes, but it is also the type of infrastructure that opens up large swaths of land for further development by increasing accessibility. Studies estimate that already more than 10 million more kilometers of road were constructed since the turn of the 21st century. And we expect more than twice as much roads to be constructed by 2050, most of which, actually virtually all of which, will be built in developing countries. Some of these infrastructure projects we are very familiar with, we even see in the news. For example, the Belt and Road Initiative, spearheaded by China. It is not a transportation project per se, but it calls for multiple transportation projects, linking cities, integrating regional economies across Eurasia. Then there is the interoceanic highway in South America. In Africa, there are several highway corridors at various stages of completion, crisscrossing the continent. The bottom line is there is this huge push to link urban areas to each other, to more rural places through these infrastructure projects, and in the process, increasing the reach of these urbanizing regions. We also know from a lot of empirical evidence and theoretical work that this is a reinforcing process. A more extensive transportation network allows for more development, and more development creates demand for even more transportation infrastructure. So, what is the impact of this interactive development between urbanization and transportation infrastructure? What would be the impact going into the future? But the question we should ask is not how will urban land change unfold into the future, but it should be how will urban land change and road development unfold into the future. However, we conducted a review of urban land change models in the literature, and we found that none of the urban land change models incorporate this feedback. They have various types of representation of transportation, but they are all simplistic representations as static drivers of urban expansion. So my graduate student came up with this conceptual framework, which calls for an interactive urban expansion road development model, so that we can incorporate that feedback that we know exists in the real world. In the urban component, we start with generating multiple forecasts of amounts of urban expansion. This is similar to earlier iterations of this model, which we used to generate the first ever global forecast of urban expansion about 15 years ago. The difference here is that these forecasts are generated based on various input factors, demographics, economic development, but also informed by the road length. Then we allocate this forecasted amount of urban expansion across the landscape, again, based on various input factors, such as urban extent, land cover, various topographical factors, but also the distance to the road network. So these two create the link, basically constitute the half of the feedback, the one from transportation component to the urban component, and they are updated at every time step. On the transportation side, similar to the urban one, we first forecast the total road length at every time step based on a multiple linear regression framework and informed by the urban land cover. And then, again, similarly, we allocate the forecasted road length across the landscape based on various attraction centers, including urban clusters, their very spatial distribution across the landscape, various biophysical factors, the existing road network to determine the suitability, varying suitability for road development across the landscape, as well as the network characteristics of the road infrastructure, such as connectivity, centrality, and circuitness. The spatial resolution is 300 meters. The time horizon is 2050. And the time step is 10 years for now. Our eventual goal is to create global forecasts of interactive urban development and road infrastructure development. But here are preliminary findings, results from 3 very different countries. And in each one of them, the interactive model compared to the traditional, conventional, no interaction version forecasts more diffuse, more spread out urban development along with the expansion of the road infrastructure. To conclude, we know from empirical evidence and theoretical work that there is this feedback between transportation infrastructure and development. And urban land change models so far failed to account for this feedback. We argue that it is important to incorporate this interaction in land change models, urban land change models, to be able to come up with hopefully more realistic forecasts of both urban development and the expansion of the road infrastructure going into the future. And this is not a simple academic curiosity, academic exercise. There are significant implications, for example, for biodiversity and ecosystems, primarily through the fragmentation and loss of habitats, species ranges, including roadkill, and increasing exposure of a more extensive infrastructure network to natural hazards, which we know will be exacerbated also by climate change. Not all the impacts are negative though. A more extensive road network increases accessibility of rural areas, allowing for bringing various services, for example, healthcare. Likewise, it also allows farmers in peri-urban and rural places to bring their produce to a larger number of markets in a shorter amount of time. But then again, not all the roads are planned or formal. There's a lot of road construction that is occurring informally or even illegally. And there are many implications of those across, for example, resource frontiers as well. Thank you. And I would like to answer any questions you may have.
Hi, thanks for the talk. And sorry if I missed it, but I didn't quite get where did you get the parameters for the effects of the different determinants of future roads from? Did you estimate those from historical time series, or how did you do it?
Thank you for that question. So for urban land, we have the historical data now that we could calibrate and validate the models. For road network, all we have is a single road network, global road network, that is cobbled from very many different sources. So what we do is we do a multiple linear regression and compare the predicted road lengths for the for the current time, so to speak, to what we have from that road network data set. And I have it. This is how we can basically build confidence in the road component, because we only have a snapshot of the road network.
And that's the length of the road and the specific positions of the road?
That is only the length.
Yeah.
And there is actually one published work, Meyer et al. In ERL, the Environmental Research Letters. We basically follow the same approach. The only difference is we also get input from the urban component in the multiple linear regression framework.
Thank you very much. Hopefully we'll have time at the end of the session, as long as we stay on track. So we are having our fourth presenter is another good friend of mine, Rodrigo Lopez Barrios, Rodrigo and I have been joining our group almost weekly for the last few years. Welcome, Rodrigo.
Thank you, Professor. Hi everyone. So I'm going to present this work that is an ongoing model that we are doing with my colleagues. So I'm open now. Okay. I can hear myself very well. So the work that I'm going to present you is addressing spatiotemporal non-stationarity in land cover change, and the case of the deforestation, the prediction in Brazil. And the motivation is that there are very few methodologies for predicting deforestation, and here we want to contribute another way to assess the prediction models for predicting the degradation of the forest. And here the problem is predicting temporal non-stationarity deforestation that is represented by binary data with convolutional neural networks. We are not using here exogenous variables, just binary data in order to produce any forecast that improves a baseline model that I'm going to tell you in the next slides. And also we are trying to characterize the spatial non-stationarity and its modeling with classic neural networks. So the deforestation, when we see the data, we often find that this data is non-stationarity, is not stationary, and that means that this data must be transformed in a way that we can model it to produce some kind of forecast with the minimum bias. And in the right side, we have the problem with the spatial non-stationarity, where from one year to another year, we see we can identify shifts in the spatial distribution of deforestation. So these problems are combined in order to predict the deforestation. So we are going to use this database downloaded from the map biomass, and this the database that we are using has 36 binary maps, representing just the presence of deforestation. And the region of interest has a little bit more than 500,000 cells where each map pixel represents a region of 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. So when we see the cumulative deforestation, we can see clearly where is the non-stationarity here. And a definition of the non-stationarity in a univariate time series is that are those properties, such as the mean and the variance, that when the time series is not stationary, they are changing over the time. So every time we want to measure the mean is changing, or the variance is changing. So here we have like a very clear trend of this accumulative time series. And in order to stabilize the time series, we need to process it with a very simple operation. And we need to differentiate it several times until we obtain a stable time series like the red one and the orange one. And once we have this stable time series, we can proceed to use another linear and autoregressive method to find the best parameters to produce the forecast. So the differentiating is very simple. It consists of calculating the difference of every pair of consecutive values of a time series. And for the second order differencing is to apply twice the first order differencing, and so on. And we apply the same process until we stabilize the time series. And with the convolutional network approach, I'm going to connect the justification of this. We have an input, and the convolutional neural networks are a kind of neural networks which considers the elemental structure of the data in the intermediate layers. So they can be applied to time series, images, or series of time images. And here we have a convolution operation that is applied to the input, and it is the sum of all the multiplications in order to produce a new output that is processed by the next layer. And then the final layer produces a final output. And here the relation of the convolutional neural networks is that the differentiating is a special case of convolution operation, but with fixed parameters. So that means that we are not worried for these parameters with the optimization process. Now we can obtain an equivalent K matrix that is going to do the work of the differentiating automatically. So in the experiment, we are transforming the data. We group the forested pixels according to a grid cell, where each one represents a region of 30 by 30 kilometers in your right. And for the spatial non-stationarity, for each pixel, for each grid pixel, we produce an histogram that describes the spatial allocations, shifts of deforestation in function of the distance of the non-forest of a region. Here we have a sequence of histograms. The columns represents one histogram, and the rows represents the bin of the histogram, that is 1 kilometer of width. And we want to model that as well. And this is the model that is, I'm going to jump it. And here are the experiments. So in the first experiment, we want to predict the quantity of deforestation increments. And we are training convolutional neural networks that associate matrix of size 15 by 15 grid cells of deforestation quantity in order to identify automatically the spatial context of the deforestation, and we associate this matrix with its future values at central location, like in this example. And we want to minimize this function, that is the matrix of deforestation increments associated with its future values at central location here. And we test 4 models, Model 1, Model 2, and Model 3, with different maps, with different numbers of observation in the past to produce a forecast, and we compare that with a baseline model, that is the naive model, and we have these results. We have the root mean square error, and then as soon as we add more observations in the past to produce the forecast, the root mean square error starts to decrease. But when we add a new one observation more in the past, the model starts to decrease for any reason. And these are the results for the histogram prediction. And we are observing two histograms in the past to produce the next one. And in this case, the model behaves much better. And now we have like a descriptive model that helps you to identify the shifts here. And we see that the neural network behaves relatively better than the naive model here. And we see that in all the time steps, it provides a better prediction than the simple model. And for the conclusions, we observe a slight improvement with respect to naive model for predicting the increments of the deforestation. And when we add the 3 observations in the past to produce a forecast, the model performance decreases, maybe because we think this is an overfitting effect. The training set is much bigger than the testing set, and maybe that is producing this effect, adding one observation more to and degrade the performance of the model. The image time series presents a pattern that is very difficult to identify because there are a lot of noise. We suggest if somebody wants to follow this approach, to measure the performance comparing among different models to identify those ones that produce the minimum error prediction at the minimum resolution possible. And for predicting the local distribution of the deforestation, the neural network works well, and we have a model that describes the shifts and can anticipate it in a proper way. Thank you.
So I have a question related to stationarity. So you have checked only stationarity with respect to mean. Do you think, did you check for the variance also?
No, I didn't check it.
Because variability in variance also will lead to prediction error.
The thing here is that I just wanted to give like an intuition. Okay, just to see that it's evident that we have a clear pattern even with the first differentiation. And the good thing is that with neural networks, they instead of having a hard convolutional matrix with 1 and -1 for differentiation.
You're back in physics.
Here it's evident that with the first difference, the time series is still non-stationarity. It's not stationary. We have now a negative trend here, and that is the important thing that I wanted to transmit. And then for the next differentiation, we have the red line that now visually it seems more stable than the first one, and so on. But yes, I haven't tested that, but visually I wanted to transmit that in order to find the parameters, that thing is automatic, and I think it's worth to see what's happening inside of the convolutional neural network, to see what are the coefficients of the kernel matrices, to see how it's working with the time series to stabilize it automatically.
Good, thank you. Well, our next presenter, I just had the pleasure to meet yesterday. We have Felipe Diaz from Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the great state of Tennessee in the United States.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm a research associate in the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the United States. So I'm going to talk about this initial concept that we are exploring around trying to use generative AI as part of land use and land cover forecasting framework. So, great thing is that I don't need to spend too much time talking about what land use land cover is. One thing I'm going to highlight, I'm going to mention quite a bit of things related to the National Land Cover Database produced by the USGS for the entire contiguous United States. So I want to give context instead of why we are looking into land cover forecasting. And this is part of a bigger project spanning multiple institutions in the US called the Southeastern Texas Urban Integrated Field Laboratories. What we are trying to look here is trying to understand and act in terms of risks, vulnerability associated with air pollution and flood risks in this particular area of the Southeastern Texas. So this is spanned across multiple disciplines and across multiple teams. This includes going from the environmental side to the co-design of interacting with the local community to understand what is to be considered in the models, what are the best actions to take considering their opinions on how to communicate the research. And as one part that we have across this whole cross-cutting interactions is the environmental characterization with the water component. For the water component, for the hydrological models, you need to understand what is the land use and the land cover, in particular in the sense of impermeability or imperviousness. So that's where it comes into play. Why me, a guy that am a computer vision, machine learning specialist, doing mostly work with high resolution imagery analysis for urban infrastructure mapping and so on, we started to interact with folks both within the lab and the other institutions, more from the environmental sciences, more for urban dynamics and so on. Quick brief about generative AI. Most of you might have heard it from ChatGPT types of generative AI. You have image synthesis types of generative AI. Things such as those imaging or stable diffusion that you can prompt a text caption and get a realistic image out of it. You have video versions out of it. They are essentially present the model with several frames of a sequence. You try to synthesize what the next frame looks like for purposes such as anticipating actions by a self-driving car. So coming from this intuition and then talking more like from a scientific guidance of why generative AI can be relevant for this type of problem, we can try to think about this idea of forecasting as a data synthesis problem that you're trying to frame by conditioning on historical data sets, on auxiliary data sets, and then trying to bring some physics-driven understanding about the physical world and other drivers that we know are relevant for that. So we can think about the terrain, we can think about the infrastructure, as was mentioned in the previous presentation, and many other things. And there are desirable properties. Desirable properties in the sense, most of this data is very high dimensional. It's hard for you to describe in terms of equations all the relationships, so there can be a benefit of a data-driven approach to learn from these large data sets increasingly available out there. You can have this aspect of convolutional networks and so on, learning more relationships spatially and temporally than assuming local connectivity and assuming just a Markov chain type of temporal dimension that only considers one step of time change. And also, models such as diffusion models that I'll talk more about, they allow you to synthesize multiple outputs. And that's very important for a problem that's non-deterministic like forecasting. Key idea about diffusion models and about generative models. Generative models for purposes such as like image synthesis and characterization, they rely on the idea of trying to map those very complex data distributions into a latent space that are simpler, more tractable distributions. You can do that using generative adversarial networks, or GANs, that what most people heard about in the past. And more recently with diffusion models, where the core idea is that you can imagine, essentially it's like a Markov chain, that you have two processes. The forward process, you can imagine like this is a map, a patch of imperviousness land in one part of the US. You start to add more and more noise to this map, to this image, let's say. To the point that at some point it becomes like pure Gaussian noise. Great, that's easy to handle and to track to. But how do you make that useful? You make that useful by training a model to do the reverse process, to do the denoising. At each of those steps, you present the model in this version, try to reconstruct that one, for instance. Such that at the very end, what you have is a model that you can use to go from initial random samples, you start to denoise, more and more and more to something that looks like it came from your original data distribution. And then to make it particularly useful, you make it conditions. Like you want to synthesize something that's more local or more to some kind of driver. We are working so far with experiments with imperviousness data because it's a continuous variable compared to discrete length goals category that's going to be harder. So there's going to be extension later. And we are working with two conditions. First, it's presenting, for example, 3 timestamps of maps of the past to the model. Second, it's incorporating a little bit more from traditional methods like the understanding that you have suitability matrices. So this idea of computing the statistics of transition between land cover categories across each timestamp. And then what we do is then to convert this into statistics of likelihood of transitioning in one in previous category. So on a category of development, because we have from these databases the definitions that this level of intensity is proportional to the amount of impervious surfaces. So that gives a little bit of a more regional understanding to the model, and as well an understanding of things like water bodies shouldn't become impervious all of a sudden. Quickly, experience that we're doing is with the National Land Cover Database. That's about 30 meters per pixel. You have data from 2001 to 2021, about 2 to 3 years time steps. We're looking into patches to the model at about 128 by 128 pixels, so that's about 4 by 4 kilometers. Then what we do is that we have data for entire US. We split into a 50-50% ratio that we use 50% for training, and then we're checking results across 12 highlighted in purple areas of interest here, selected diversely in terms of levels of development and overall latitude, longitude. There are some tricks we do in terms of dealing with the imbalance of the data. I can talk more about later, but it's essentially looking at the time series clustering using dynamic time warping, sampling according to that. And first, I'm gonna talk just a quick example of qualitative. So we have presenting the model with data from 2013, 16, and 19, trying to test the reconstruction of what the map actually looked like in imperviousness in 2021. It's more useful to look into changes to highlight where things are happening in terms of transitions. So we looked at how was in the conditions, how was finally at 2021. You can see that there are areas that you experience a little bit more transition over time. You would expect the model to pick that. So when we look at, for example, 3 samples from the model conditioning on those inputs, we can see that they can vary spatially at a very fine grain, but there is this overall notion of picking where in these areas changes are more likely to happen. So that's a good sign. How do we quantify that? What we are doing so far is this basic approach of comparing to a null model, naive null model assumes no change at all, and then we look at multi-scale evaluation. Where does it do any better than just assuming that no change at all happens? We know that R-square, honestly, for this kind of problem is not very informative. It's no change at all, even it's going to be 98% at some point. It's more useful to maybe look at R-square just for the changes. So that gives a sense that for a resolution like 3 by 3, like 3 kilometers square, we see about 30% of the change being picked. And here I'm talking about 10-year prediction. So we see up to 2011 in the model, 2021 in the prediction. But I think the most insightful metric to look at for this type of problem is the mean absolute error, trying to understand this relationship with the new model, what resolution you actually see something better. So we saw across those 12 areas of interest that were not part of the training data at all, at 1 kilometer square that we start to outperform the new model, so explain some change. And we can look as well, break down across these different areas of interest to see some patterns of biases. And then what we observed is like, it can be as good as 300 meters square for areas that are more experiencing higher pace of development, while for areas that are more like saturated, so to say, or experience lower level of development, is a little bit worse, around 2 kilometers square, and that points to the pattern of the model being biased or predicting more change rather than the opposite. So this is what we got so far. We saw that there is some variances that are able to pick by just looking at historical data, but of course that's not the final solution. There's much more we want to look into incorporating these auxiliary data sets and incorporating drivers, like trying to control from other information like sustainable development paths, some information to the model, how they should be synthesized. And one of the reasons I'm here is to learn more about this and about evaluation, because I mentioned those metrics, but there are other patterns such as looking at what we know from urban infrastructure and relationship to inequality and population. Those are some things we're looking at with my colleague Parthen Dupandi, that's more an expert on that. And yeah, that's it. So thank you.
Thanks, Philip. Philip, that's a very interesting research using generative AI to predict future land use. I have two technical questions about that. I can see you are using the 128 by 128 patch to train the model. So during prediction or inference, we need to concatenate all the 128 by 128 patches. So is there any edge effects on that,
So
on the prediction?
yeah, that's a great question and applies for this research or any type of mapping at scale. What we usually do is that you do overlaps between your patches, that then you can discard that area. It is one area for investigating further, like if there is limitation of is 3.8 by 3.8 kilometers large enough, and is like an overlap of 100 meters enough, or you have noises out of that. But overall, that's the idea, how we do that.
Oh, thank you. My second technical question is, the convolutional neural networks doesn't care about the order of the input band. So the band for 2010, 2020, 2030 doesn't seem different if we input the band by 2030, 2020, 2010. My question is, do you ever think about embedding the time as a predictive variable?
That's a great question. And but one thing that's interesting is that you can see that I'm not feeding as an input those conditions. Getting a little bit more technical, where those conditions come at is where you have the normalization layers of your neural network. So there is one technique called SPADE that's used a lot across those image synthesis models, that you expose the model on that. But what you can also do is to have other sets of conditions that are more like numerical values. You already have in diffusion models for giving the level of noise. You can imagine passing the time explicitly, or you can imagine maybe passing like what is the expected level of development as another condition.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'm double-fisted. You get me in stereo. And there I am again. For those of you who don't know me, you might call me Robert. For those of you who do know me, you call me by the first half of my middle name, Gil. I've been a geography professor at Clark University for 27 years now, and I've been asking the same question for 27 years. How and why do some authors claim that their models are good? Which I frequently see that claim about 4 o'clock in the morning when I get my message from ResearchGate that sends me one PDF per morning I have with my coffee that cites one of my papers. Typically, there's an author telling me that their data or results are good. That motivated this talk. So here are the main points, 4 main points of this talk. Some authors claim that their modeling results are good despite using fundamentally flawed metrics, is what I usually see in my ResearchGate inbox. we really must design metrics that are relevant to the research question, which is remarkably challenging. You think, oh, well, obviously you want a metric that's related to your research question. I've been involved with a group that has been meeting weekly for 2.5 years, and we're still looking to find a metric that's relevant for our research question. It's a non-trivial thing, but we've made plenty of progress with actually some my colleagues who are in the room here. If you want to know more about this, I'll see you in my workshop tomorrow afternoon from 3:45, from 2:15 to 3:45, just down the hall. And if you have a time series of data and you want to get involved in a special issue of the journal Land that uses a new methodology, please write to me. We're looking for submissions within the next 12 months or so. So here's a typical quote that I see. The simulation results of luck in 2020. Oh, so first of all, notice, I think luck has something to do with change, but it's in 2020. So they're looking at a single time point. So they're missing the change. In 2020, we're calibrated quantitatively and spatially using kappa, overall accuracy, and figure of merit. The quantitative calibration yields a kappa of 0.8, overall accuracy of 92%, indicating that the accuracy is guaranteed. I guess the accuracy of how well this model can predict the future. The FOM value of the spatial calibration, they've got a number closer to 0 than to 1, but they've read the literature that Peter Verberg and I put together several years ago with this figure of merit thing that shows most of the cases we looked at had a figure of merit less than 0.2. And so they said, oh, we're right in the center of the crowd here. So with the paper we published, we never used the word good, but now people say, oh, if I've got a figure of merit 0.2, it must be good. We know from the references that the figure of merit value of most scholars' experimental results is within 0.3, these results being the most common. Therefore, all these tests are within a reasonable, according to what reason, I don't know, indicating that the model and parameter settings can be used for future land use prediction simulations. Here's an equation for the figure of merit. Even the logic here I find a bit bizarre, because in many cases people are making future scenarios that are designed to deviate entirely from the previous data. So you don't need a model that extrapolates the past and pretends to predict the future. You need a model that you can actually control the quantity and the allocation. So for those of you maybe not exactly familiar with kappa, it's quiz time. This is audience participation part of the show. We've got a map, a spatial area of 10 pixels. And if you believe in ground truth, this is your map of ground truth. But many of us don't believe in truth anymore after being in this business for a while. And so here are the reference data. Here's your best available data. You've got 10 pixels. You've got 2 categories, yellow and blue. If you need to think in terms of planetary surface, think of blue as water, yellow is not water. You've got 3 classifiers. Number 1, number 2, number 3. We're going to have a vote here saying how democracy is being applied. Well, it was applied in my country somewhat yesterday. How many people, so here's the question. Which comparison map is the best agreement with the reference map? How many for comparison map number 1? Ooh, okay. How many for comparison map number 2? Comparison map number 2. It's pretty close. And how many for comparison map number 3? Oh, that's the first time. Usually there's at least one. You're gonna. Oh, I like that response. So he said it's a vague question. So notice that I did not define agreement, and I did not define best. And there's all sorts of ways to define agreement and best. And each metric has its own way to define that. And furthermore, personally, I don't even like the question, because the question focuses on agreement. And I don't think we learn very much by focusing on the agreement. I focus on the disagreement. So one popular metric is proportion correct. 90% of the pixels agree with this one. 80% that one, and 20% that one. There's a very popular metric, kappa. And kappa, for this one, kappa is an index that can range from +1 to -1, and where a higher number means higher agreement. So kappa for this one is 0, for this one is negative, and for this one is positive. So according to kappa, this is the best match among these three with that one. I don't like to think I think both of those metrics have big problems. I like to think in two metrics of disagreement: quantity disagreement and allocation disagreement. Here, when the quantity is how many, when you just count the number of pixels in terms of quantity, ignoring the spatial allocation. Well, this has 1 blue one, this has 0 blue ones, and so the quantity difference is 0.1. Here, there's no quantity difference. They both have 1 blue one, but there's 2 pixels that have allocation difference. And over here, well, this yellow one is in one of the yellow places there, so the allocation is already as good as it can possibly be. And so all of the disagreement is a quantity disagreement, and there's no allocation disagreement. Okay, so that's how I tend to think in terms of these map comparisons, differences in terms of quantity and allocation. So I've been obsessing about this for decades now, and my doctoral student and I, Marco Milonas, 13 years ago published this paper entitled Death to Kappa. It had 2 main messages: don't use kappa, and instead use quantity and allocation disagreement. So this has skyrocketed to be our most highly cited paper, now with more than 2,000 citations. And here's a sample. We come out hitting hard, I think. This article concludes that these kappa indices are useless, misleading, and or flawed. And it goes to, we're just getting warmed up with those words. And so it's remarkable when I get my gifts from ResearchGate how people cite the Death to Kappa paper. Here's a typical one. Kappa coefficient has proved to be an excellent. And it's like, we made the title because we knew people did not read the articles that they cite. But if it's in the first part of the title, you'd think they have to at least read the citations of the articles that they're citing. Evidently not. And so, and I've got lots and lots of examples of this. So I decided to do a more systematic review of the literature. I worked with another one of my students. We sampled 200 papers that had cited the Death to Kappa paper. And we tagged each article concerning whether or not it adopted the first recommendation to abandon kappa and whether it adopted the second recommendation to use the difference components. Got some remarkable results. So the author could have done 1 or 2 things for the first recommendation, adopt or not, and 1 or 2 things for the second recommendation, adopt or not. So there's 4 possibilities. Turns out when we looked at all the articles, nearly a quarter of the papers fell into each of the 4 possibilities. Okay? So some authors adopted both recommendations, some authors only the first recommendation to abandon kappa, some only the second recommendation, and some, they followed both, followed only the first, followed only the second. followed neither. So what this means is half of the papers that cited the death to kappa paper still used kappa. It's just remarkable. Humans are remarkable in their behavior. So with those metrics, but we were that example that I showed was at only one time point. But in land change modeling, we're interested in the change. And so what typically frequently do, people will compare a time 2 prediction to the time 2 reference. But you don't see the change. You've really got to see the change. So if you look at the time 1, there's change only in these few pixels. So this one is a miss, a hit, a wrong hit, and a false alarm. And all of the gray ones, they're correct rejections. Change did not occur, and the model predicted change did not occur. Well, a null model could have also predicted that. So I would just find it much more helpful if people would just report those few components and just don't pass judgment. You don't need to claim victory. In fact, I think it's very tricky to find a metric to justify any claim of victory, but we're obligated to communicate clearly. Okay, so much of this work goes back to a publication many of us were involved in several years ago, actually in 2008, and then we had a follow-up paper in 2018. We had 13 applications that showed that 12 had more error than hits at the resolution of the data. And we presented this many times, and we got some interesting responses. From the non-modelers, we get this. Your colleagues must hate you. But it's remarkable what we get from the modelers. Just the opposite. Thank you for exposing this, because now I can publish anything. And the biggest breakthrough is we got people relieved that they could actually speak openly. And so I'll encourage you to speak to either me or Rishi or Aaron or Salvador about a method that we've developed that addresses many of the pet peeves that I have, and I've got many of them. So again, please do these things. If you're interested in hearing more about this, please, I'll see you tomorrow afternoon. If you want more information about the methods that we've developed, here's a website that you can visit. If you know of any literature that shows a well-designed method for model validation, and actually the previous presenter had a wonderful approach, please let me know. And if you want to participate in a special issue that analyzes a time series of data, please let me know. Because one thing I've learned from a career in modeling, I can probably learn just as much from looking at the data as I can from going through a modeling and prediction process. Thank you. So I'll take one question, and we'll have questions for anyone in any of our presenters. There you go.
Thanks, Gil. So you're suggesting to present the hits misses map? Just present that map?
Hits, false alarms, and misses. Just right. Show the map, but your eye can also be fooled with the colors and the spatial allocation. So just I usually give a segmented bar in the form of a Venn diagram, where one ball of the Venn diagram is the reference change, the other circle is the simulated change, and where they intersect are the hits. And where they're in one set and not the other, it's either a false alarm or a miss. And just leave it at that. Yes.
So I agree on the importance on focusing on the things that actually change. I get that. At the same time, I would say that some questions just only care about the hits, some only care about the misses, only about the false alarms, etc. So rather than having one metric that forces users to consider all of them, can you not force them to become explicit about what actually matters for their research question and then custom design a metric that's appropriate for them?
That is the thing I think everyone should be doing. You've got to figure out what is your research question, and then either adopt or design a metric for your particular research question. And in our experience, it's a non-trivial thing, because you might get starting to do the modeling, and then you have model output, and then you start looking at metrics, and then you realize, oh, our research question was vague. And then you go back to the modeling, and then you adjust either the model, and then you think more about how to measure it. And so it's a learning process of getting more precise, of figuring out why you're doing it and how to measure what you're doing. Speak in the microphone.
My point is, I've seen and enjoyed many of your rants before.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, many people will not have sufficient knowledge of what they're doing. And I think one bone that you could throw them is a simple R package that makes it as easy as possible for them to guide them to those decisions and not have to worry about that. And I think your rants might become slightly less extreme over time, because you would take some of the not so educated people along.
Okay. There are, yeah, that's interesting. There are some R packages that do like a multiple resolution measurement of the hits, misses, false alarms, and correct rejections. But what's interesting is if you want to get those, you just do a 3-map overlay. I mean, I don't know if people need an R package for that, but you need to do the overlay and then categorize each pixel as its particular type. Thank you for your comments. Yeah.
I appreciate the rule of thumb there with the hits, misses, and false alarms, but surely that would be sensitive to the resolution or the amount of change. So you'd have to have a proportional measure, like figure of merit.
Oh, yeah. That's what I thought a while ago. And then I saw how people abuse the figure of merit. And, well, again, you have to think of what is your particular research question. But if you go back and think of what this figure of merit does, I think one of the worst things the figure of merit does is it takes these helpful bits of information and wraps them into one number. So if I know just the relative size of misses and false alarms, I know if I've over-predicted the quantity or under-predicted the quantity. But if I know the figure of merit, I don't know if I've over-predicted the quantity or under-predicted the quantity.
So is there a couple of other metrics then that are sort of subsets of the figure of merit that would provide a relative metric of, you know, the number of false alarms over the total number of changed cells or something like that?
Yeah, there could be, but I get fearful of complicated math that has things like division, because frequently, you know, when you have a ratio, you have a helpful to know numerator and you have a helpful to know denominator, and then when you do the division, you have one unhelpful ratio. So I like to think in terms of just the sizes of these things and make them very interpretable. I think if just people think about what is a miss, what's a hit, what's a false alarm, and what's a wrong hit. A wrong hit is when the model predicted change did occur, but the model predicted the wrong gaining category. If people just look at those components, stop and think, then I think that'd be much more helpful than I've seen how people have abused the figure of merit and other metrics. Okay, yes.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed your work in the past 15 years or so, and also watched some of your webinars, which were very enjoyable in the pandemic. I just want to comment on the 4 colored cells. I think if I would present it in a paper, it would be nice to give it a content or context. So what is the false alarm in this land use change context actually mean? Is it like over-predicted water area whatsoever? Because then it's better to understand instead of just saying false alarm. For me, it would be already very helpful, and not many people are doing it, however.
Oh, right.
That's the point.
Right.
I think that's already giving a lot of context.
Yeah, I realize it's a sales. I realize we're now getting to the point of it's a sales pitch. Now, I know no one in this room would ever think of using kappa, but how do we reach those other people that are, the majority of the literature that I see is telling me kappa and figure of merit and percent correct, and it's remarkably misleading. And I think it's sociological problems. People feel an obligation to claim victory because they think that's what they need to do to keep their job or to graduate. But if you follow that philosophy, you're always going to be a follower. You'll never be a leader, and you'll never discuss what the problems are, and we need to discuss the challenges in order to make any progress. Are there questions for the other presenters?
While waiting for if there is any other question to any of the presenters, I have two announcements. First of all, thank you all for coming to this session. I have a poll attached to this session on WUHA or WUHA. So it's about your major takeaways from this session, whatever they may be. It may be an observation, a finding, something you learn new. So if you could please fill that out, that would help me and also the GLP organizers in getting feedback from the sessions. And we will have another gathering right after the lunch at 1:30 in this room. The second part of the talks. We'll have a lot more time for discussion. So if you could come to that one, we could have maybe a roundtable discussion about whatever presented here in this session and also in the next one, in the second one. Thank you.